basically our goals here today are to help you identify accessibility challenges with extended reality technologies. And we've done a lot of the legwork here so that you'll leave today with a couple of gems that you'll be able to start your own development or assessing off-the-shelf products using these resources so that you can remove the barriers. And like the image on the right here that is depicting a virtual reality world, someone might be using a device to enter into that space and they feel like they are really there in that space. What does it mean for people with accessibility issues? How do we help everyone move forward into investigating the space and not leave anybody behind as this shift happens? Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are located. The lands traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Neutral people. I hope I got that pronunciation right. I like this example because it shows higher education's commitment to advancing reconciliation, and it's doing so by introducing students to an emerging digital shift and emerging technology. So the course is actually taught using virtual reality. You can see the image on the left here. The student is using a virtual reality device, and the image on the right is a screen capture of the inside of that digital world where people are interacting, they're communicating as avatars, digital representations of people. And that student probably feels pretty plausible that they're in that digital space. We'll do just a quick review, or maybe this is new for you, of the differences between AR and VR. So the previous example that we showed of the Indigenous Language Learning course where the students were meeting elders is virtual reality, feeling like you are in that space. Here's another example from the University of Ottawa, where the Faculty of Law is investigating, they're using a virtual reality world to conduct moot trials. And so introducing students to the technology again for the purpose of looking at how the future of law might be changed or impacted by these technologies. And so this diagram here is showing you that all of these technologies can be experienced on using different devices. So a mobile, desktop, or headset. But if we think of this virtual space where they're in a courtroom, it's probably more believable or more plausible if they're using a headset. And so that's really the transformational power of the technology is using the device. But for the purposes of education, we're probably going to be starting with mobile and desktop because that's what we have access to. That's what our students have access to. So here we have augmented reality. Someone is using a mobile device, an iPad, and information is overlaid into the physical environment. So people see their physical environment and they're using the technology to enhance it. So that's showing the distinction there between AR and VR. And I just wanted to show one more example. This is an example of complex augmented reality, where what you're seeing here is a view. So pretend you are an astronaut in outer space. You're wearing HoloLens glasses, and you are interacting with a digital representation of a doctor who is also wearing the HoloLens glasses, and you're interacting with each other. It feels plausible that you are there together in the same place, in your physical space, and the doctor is added into your space. So I like to show this example because for me, this is really the transformation that a decade from now will have great impact on how we communicate with each other. And if we're starting to investigate these technologies now, we'll be well on our way to being able to use them for their full potential when we can later on. All right, so just a little bit of an overview of the different kinds of AR and VR. So Antonina is going to show you an example of a 360 VR. 360 VR being really just a photograph of in 360 degrees, and Antonina will show you a chemistry lab that is preparing students to go into the lab and do training, safety training for some equipment. And so that's a good use case for that kind of virtual reality that can be experienced on a desktop or with the headset mostly. But I think it's just a desktop that we've created for that purpose. We'll also take a quick look at social VR, which I've been talking about the most so far, and simulations. Simulations is really just the same thing as social VR. It's a virtual world. Essentially, it's a digitally created world. And simulations are kind of starting to take off in industry now because they're seeing how that this can be useful for training people. So if you feel like you're actually there on a factory floor and you can step by step learn a procedure, you can actually gain experience and feel like have a better understanding of that experience. That's the use case there. And then we'll talk generally about augmented reality. I think as a group we could do a little more work really defining what identifying what augmented reality is, but really the most simplest is interacting with a 3D object or model, and that is probably what's happening in the classroom right now because students have phones and the access is there. We also know that Apple really hasn't gotten into the AR/VR game, but is expected to in 2023, and they're going to probably sway where things go. And the phones are all equipped with AR, so I think we'll start to see a lot more activity with AR happening in the next year. AR is in industry, for example, is seen as going to be useful for remote assistance. So being able to collaborate, and let's say you're a developer on a site, checking out a site, someone who's back in the office can also kind of be there as well and collaborate with you. So that's just the lay of the land. And now I'm going to turn it over to Christine. Christine is going to bridge us into accessibility and start with some definitions. And then Lynn is going to remind us that with all of these technologies, and there are a lot here to choose from, how do you choose from this list? Well, it's really about your learning outcomes and what you're trying to, your goals and what you want your students to know and do. And so Lynn has been working on a framework for choosing technologies and can share a little bit of her knowledge there. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Christine, and the definitions.
Thanks, Jillian. So yeah, we'll take a look at a few definitions. Next slide, please. We'll start with accessibility. So accessibility is defined as the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people who experience disabilities. So the focus on accessibility is removing barriers for people who experience disabilities. So it's important that we take a look at the definition of a disability. Next slide, please. A disability is defined as the result of a combination of impairments and environmental barriers that affect people's full participation in society. Now, I've abridged that from the original Ontario Human Rights Commission definition, but it is a definition that is shared by accessibility legislation. And I just want to point out that an important feature of this definition is that disability is recognized as that interaction between the person and their environment. It's a common misperception or misconception that only a small minority of people have a disability, and that disability is the exception to the norm. And some people feel that designing for disabilities or designing or accommodating disabilities for that small minority is done as a quote unquote favor. and that favor somehow disadvantages the non-disabled. But in reality, removing barriers for people with disabilities helps most people with whether it's learning in a course or navigating an environment. And in reality, disability is not the exception to the norm. It's part of the norm, whether we're talking about a permanent or maybe a temporary disability. And according to Statistics Canada, 22% of Canadians aged 15 and older identify as having a disability. In the university context, the most current Canadian University Consortium survey of first-year students, undergrads, shows that 31% of them identify as having a disability. So this is in no way a very small minority. An important way to decrease disability is to avoid creating the barriers in the first place. So we're going to take a look at two definitions that aim to do that. And universal design is one of them, and inclusive design is the other. Next slide, please, Jillian. Universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So the goal is to eliminate barriers at the initial design stage, not as an afterthought later. The concept of universal design originated in the built environment, and it has been applied to education. So let's take a really quick look at what the built environment looks like on our campus. Next slide, please. So we have two photos on this slide. The photo on the left of the screen is the entrance to Needles Hall, where the accessibility services and counseling services exists. And in this photo, there are several steps from the ground level up to the level where there is access to the main doors. And this photo also shows that there is an accommodation needed because the steps themselves are a barrier for many people. So the accommodation is the ramp, in this case, a very long and windy ramp off to the side, which is providing that accommodation. And I want to contrast that to the entrance to the Davis Center, which is shown in the photo on the right on the screen. And the entrance to the Davis Center shows a ground level entrance, no steps, no barriers. And it also shows automatically opening doors. So in this type of entrance, this is a good example of universal design because there are no barriers to accommodate for. So this idea of designing at the outset to not include barriers and to be as usable to as most people as possible carries through in other settings in addition to the built environment, whether we're talking about education or service and other areas. So I'm going to just touch on one last definition. Next slide, please. And that's the idea of inclusive design. Inclusive design and universal design were used synonymously years ago, back in like the 50s, but there has grown to be a bit of a difference between these two concepts. Inclusive design is the design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. And I want to emphasize this idea of difference here, because this definition is not about disability, it's about differences. And this concept of inclusive design conceptualizes disability as being inherently tied to design and resulting from the mismatch between how something is designed and how the user would need to use it. So the focus is not on disabilities, it's on users' needs, and it's on users, rather than users with disabilities. The last thing I want to say about this definition or this concept is that it really does subscribe to the notion that disability can be experienced by anybody who is excluded from the design. So you don't need to have an inherent impairment at the individual level. Anybody can be impaired or disabled if they are not able to use something the way it was designed. So with those definitions, I'll leave you with a final thought as you carry on in this session, and that is to design for diversity and to aim for inclusion right from the outset. These are not things that are to be added on after as an afterthought. So even if you're not designing the augmented reality or virtual reality, then you are still choosing and selecting how to use it and which to use. So in that process, I would encourage you to think about diversity and aim for inclusion. Thank you, and I think I'll be turning it back over to Lynn now.
Thanks, Christine. If you could move to the next slide, Jillian. So I think this slide may overlap a little bit with what Jillian talked about already, but there are also some additional concepts here. So as I move into the topic of pedagogy and using XR for teaching, I just wanted to talk about the extended reality spectrum so that some of the terminology that I'm using is clear. The term extended reality encompasses a wide spectrum of virtual environments, starting with true physical reality at the less immersive end of the spectrum and extending to 100% virtual immersion at the upper end. And the two most commonly referred to areas of extended reality are augmented reality and virtual reality. But there's another commonly referred to option, which is mixed reality. And I can see a typo on my image here because that mixed reality should be represented by MR. I have a second AR there, so I apologize. So augmented reality places virtual objects in a learner's real world environment. And I have a video clip here. Jillian, if you could click on the blue video clip there. This is an example of augmented reality. Jillian mentioned that augmented reality could be used in a classroom to represent multivariable calculus, so students can interact with and visualize what a mathematical function might look like, and even change that function on the fly and see how that would impact it. Actually, I'm currently part of a research project that is using this exact tool, GeoGebra, an augmented reality tool, and comparing it to CalcVR, a virtual reality tool for classroom use to see how they impact student learning. So that is a current and ongoing project at the moment. Virtual reality involves total immersion in a virtual world, and often headgear is worn to cover the eyes and sometimes the ears. Handheld controllers may be used to allow the user to interact with the 3D objects within the virtual experience. But even within the category of virtual reality, the level of immersion can vary. Increased immersion generally creates a greater sense of actually being present in the 3D environment, rather than simply looking at it. And so I have another video clip here, Jillian, if you could click on it. And you can see here that what it looks like, I'm walking out on a plank, and here's what the user is actually experiencing. They've got their headset and their hand controller. So it's a much more immersed environment. And if you were hearing the audio of this clip, you would hear that this fellow there's actually some bleeps there because he's actually pretty terrified. And so when I talk about increasing levels of immersion, you can see how the difference between the augmented and virtual reality. And mixed reality then falls between the two on the spectrum, blending the real and the virtual worlds. Jillian, if you could move on to the next slide. So I just want to talk about the pedagogical, the focus of pedagogy when using XR. It can be really tempting when considering XR options to go with the wow factor that comes with more immersive options. And there certainly is a place for that. Total immersion can be really beneficial. For example, when you're training a surgeon to do an intricate surgery, you want them to feel like they're really there and really working on a person. But these immersive options are usually far more expensive to develop, and they can come with additional barriers that can prevent some students from engaging. So rather than going just for total immersion as a wow factor, our goal should be to determine what technology can best achieve the desired learning outcomes while minimizing barriers. Often, the less immersive AR and VR options can enhance learning sufficiently to achieve the learning outcomes while keeping equipment costs low, minimizing development time and costs, and allowing for the learning experiences to be more flexible. An example of why flexibility would be beneficial, minimizing the level of immersion can make it easier for students who struggle with cyber sickness, for example, to take breaks as needed, to adjust the pace and the duration of their learning experience to suit their own needs. And finally, ensuring that the XR learning experience is used to enhance, but not replace other modes of learning, ensures that no one's left out, that there's no unaccounted for barriers, that will keep the student from being able to achieve those learning outcomes. So when we do this, students who aren't able to interact with the XR experience can access the learning through other modes. I believe now I'm handing it back over to Jillian.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Lynn. That's great. So what are the accessibility challenges with extended reality? Generally, like in 1999, when we started building online courses, accessibility wasn't the first consideration. So accessibility options weren't there. They weren't built in right from the start. With extended reality, the affordances, the power, the potential of these technologies don't often consider people with disabilities, and there's a lack of awareness of the challenges. And so all of that said, I'm really impressed with the extended reality accessibility community and how they're working with industry and working with the accessibility community to really start or to make accessibility a priority and to put it right at the beginning, which is where education will definitely start. And so specifically the challenges that people have, if you look at this picture here with the person wearing the headset and the controller, there will be a need for that person to be able to move their head. And also with the controllers, being able to use your hands are required. So those are challenges. And other challenges, ones that we have in online learning as well, if there's an experience that is only in audio or only in visual, then that's a challenge for some people. And how do we mitigate or circumvent these challenges? Well, we can use a lot of the knowledge that we already have for designing online courses and websites, and harking back to what both Christine and Lynn were saying, it's really about identifying inequity right from the beginning. It's about understanding our audience, knowing the challenges that they will have, and then working there from that point. It's about focusing on learning outcomes. So we're not here to create happy magic opportunities. We're here to create learning opportunities and experience opportunities, and really focusing on the knowledge and skills that you're trying to achieve. Although these formats are also known for their engagement because they are new and novel, but the wow factor isn't really, that's not your primary goal. It might be a secondary thing that happens. Other strategies that we can learn from what we can apply from what we already know. So if you're creating an experience, you're going to be designing that, and you're going to be considering the challenges that people might have. You're going to be probably creating a script and a storyboard, and those can be used as alternate formats later on, which is a good practice. Involving people with disabilities in the process, getting feedback, user testing. And the other resource that we rely on heavily now is the World Wide Web standards. So these are international standards, and they provide resources for making the web more accessible to people with disabilities. So all of this great knowledge that we already have can be applied to extended reality. And we can also look at what's emerging and what is known for accessibility with extended reality. So again, we have the World Wide Web Consortium creating standards for us, and that is going to be our go-to resource for understanding what the needs and requirements are. If you're embarking on a new project, you're going to be designing or developing or assessing an off-the-shelf product, you're going to want to look at these resources and get familiar with what has been identified here. The legwork has been done for us. It's also about finding the right tools as well. So finding the right tools for our users, the right tools and platforms. And we haven't done a lot of that ourselves. But this resource here, Regine Gilbert from Cornell is very involved in this kind of research, and this is a great video to watch. All of the resources, we'll give you the slides for this presentation, and all of the resources are at the end as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Johan, and Johan is going to take you on a journey into learning more about hardware and accessibility. So with that, I'll hand it over to Johan.
Yeah, perfect. So a big part of design for accessible VR is designing accessible hardware solutions, because there's a lot of very specific hardware involved with VR usage, at least right now. So one of the biggest issues right now with VR accessibility are kind of these baseline setup challenges. So just all of these huge barriers to entry in terms of creating accessible VR spaces. So that includes setting up your Guardian or your play area boundaries so you're not hitting things in real life, putting on or taking off a headset. If you have mobility issues, oftentimes reaching behind your head to put on something like a heavy VR headset can be a challenge. As well, things like adjusting the head strap, manipulating controllers. You can see in the picture on the top right, there's some people with mobility limitations, specifically in terms of finger dexterity, need to use both hands to manipulate a single controller, which kind of excludes them from a lot of these kind of bimanual VR applications and everything. So you kind of put up this implicit barrier that if you require people to use two hands, oftentimes you'll be excluding people with dexterity issues, at least in terms of grasping current controllers. As well, things like inaccessible buttons, like the tiny X, Y, A, B buttons on Oculus controllers can sometimes present challenges, as well as with newer headsets, keeping controllers in view is a specific requirement. With all of these, with all the headsets that have camera-based tracking of controllers, keeping them in view is necessary to actually have them be usable, which can be an issue. Say if you have your hands down at your side, you can't lift your arms as much. So there are these kind of baseline setup and usage challenges that provide kind of these big barriers of entry right now. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So a lot of the solutions right now are kind of these hardware solutions with the overall goal of this kind of bring your own device VR usage paradigm. To kind of shamelessly plug my own research, this is kind of my research area in terms of allowing VR applications to respond to the devices that people feel the most comfortable with using, rather than the user having to adapt their devices to VR itself. So this can include stuff like modified controllers, modifying headsets to make them more usable and being able to be put on more easily, as well as kind of what I'm emphasizing, these kind of bring your own input device combinations. So in the picture on the bottom, these are a bunch of examples of what people kind of call multimodal input combinations. So this involves multiple devices being used in tandem to provide one general input experience. So you've got stuff like using multiple mouse-based joysticks that each have multiple inputs, stuff like creating your own controllers and that have their own buttons that are specifically tailored to your own level of accessibility. As well, stuff like the Microsoft Adaptive Controller that allows you to use your feet and combine that with a bunch of buttons and game inputs, basically to provide an input experience tailored to your own level of accessibility, rather than trying to match your devices to the application. And as well, there are a bunch of software solutions being put together too, rather than hardware solutions. So you've got stuff like Microsoft's recent paper of 2-in-1, which is effectively a software package that allows you to, in different ways, duplicate your one hand into input for the other hand. So you can basically interact with two-handed VR applications using only one controller. As well, there's solutions like VR input amplification, which lets you basically shorten the range of necessary movement to interact with VR, basically making it more ergonomic, so that basically a full arm's reach can be done by just moving a couple of inches, as well as currently available software tools like walk-in VR, which allows you to kind of move your play space around and kind of shift things around to make things more accessible, say if you're in a wheelchair. I think their focus was mostly for wheelchair users, but I think it can be extended pretty easily. As well, there's output modification, things like Seeing VR, which is more for people with low vision or blindness. It's a software package that lets devs and users make their applications more accessible for people with low vision. So it's things like smart scene descriptions, alt text for objects in VR that are triggered based on looking at it, things like that. So basically, there's a bunch of remedies being developed in both academia and real practice. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So in terms of what's next, there are I feel like a lot of the things I talk about are kind of eliciting problems without solutions. And the kind of good news is a lot of this is being currently worked on from a lot of different angles. There's a ton of design opportunities, considering adaptive input techniques, adaptive display techniques like the blind and low vision tool, as well as a really interesting area of inclusive avatar representation. For example, does a paraplegic user want to represent an avatar that's walking, or is there kind of this middle ground between representation of people with mobility limitations being represented kind of accurately in metaverse-based applications? And there's a lot of work being done in terms of theoretical solutions, software solutions, as well as more inclusive hardware solutions. So you got the Xbox adaptive controller, as well as a device I found recently that seems really compelling. It's called a 3D rudder, and it basically works with foot tilts to provide joystick inputs, which is a really interesting way of kind of substituting that level of functionality. Yeah, and that's basically it for hardware accessibility considerations. So I'll turn it over to Antonina and talk about what's next.
Great. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to show you the VR tour that we created. Jillian, if you could just go to the website. So we made this VR tour of a chemical engineering lab. And students here can go through a few different scenes where they can zoom in, zoom out, kind of look around their scene and really see what all of the little equipment there is, or not little, it's actually like a 2-story thing. Considerations that we made as we were creating this were kind of a lot of the basic things that, we do in 2D design. So we made sure we had color contrast. So the hotspot icons are obviously highly contrasted from the surrounding image. And if you click on one of the eyes, that's going to take you to the website. If you click one of the eye icons, you'll see the text is also white on black, so it's high contrast as well. There's embedded videos, which link to YouTube, and we made sure that they all have transcripts, which were not auto-generated, so that they were actually accurate. The tour doesn't auto-play, doesn't auto-rotate, but that is an option that users can turn on. All the information boxes are HTML, so they're screen reader accessible. And then the actual website itself, so the main components section, or if you click on all of those little internet icons, is essentially a static version of the tour. Now, when we were creating this, we were new to the software, so we kind of assumed that it was, keyword accessible as we were creating it. Unfortunately, once we created the tour, we found out that wasn't the case. So then we kind of had to, rather than planning, well, we did plan for that at the outset, but we were wrong. So then we had to kind of backtrack and add in some extra accessibility. So what we did is, did you already click on can you click on the keyword accessible tour link? It's just right above the tour. There's a,
there it is there. Yeah, okay.
so we created a second version of the tour, which was a bit simplified because we couldn't figure out a way to allow users to use their keyboard to, look around the space, but also open the videos and open the websites just using the keyboard. That might be either a software limitation or just kind of a limitation of our knowledge of the software. But we created a second tour where users can use their keyboard to go to the different scenes by using A, B, C, D, E, F, as we outlined there. And then we have labeled all of the components that are talked about and then direct them to the website itself. So like the main component section, which is, like I said, is the static version of the tour. For that extra information, all the videos are there, all the descriptions are there, etc. So that was kind of our solution for that. If we go back to the slide and then skip down to slide 24. So then just some additional kind of limitations or things to consider for different limitations. So in terms of hearing, people with hearing limitations might not be able to obviously hear narration or background sound or sound effects. So when designing tours with those things, we just need to consider which items are critical to understanding what's going on in the tour and provide alternatives for those. Provide text description. So we could have on the side of our screen kind of, for each scene, perhaps had a text description of what was viewed. I'm not sure in our particular use case that would have been very effective, just based on, like, we weren't just looking at a room or, a space outside. It was a very technical equipment. So I think it might have been really hard to provide a text description, but for other cases that might work better. If you have narration, providing captions, which, like I said, we did, and you can even provide ASL videos of the descriptions as well. For vision, it was mentioned before that, headsets can cause things like nausea, eye strain, headaches, and so on. So things to consider for that is creating tours where you might not need to use it, or you don't have to necessarily use the headset. So you could just view it on your browser like this one. Providing better quality headsets for people that actually do have vision issues, because the better the quality, generally some of those issues are reduced. Again, audio descriptions with narration, text contrast, making sure that passes accessibility, the option to increase your text size or increase the spacing, high contrast versions, options to desaturate images or enlarge the cursor. Next slide, please. For cognitive, emotional learning disabilities, just making sure that the space, it can't often be a safe space for people to explore, but just making sure that it is a safe space. So, avoiding emotional triggers, making sure the environment is non-threatening, keeping activities light and simple, and also things like having an option to switch to dyslexia-friendly text. And then for physical, again, immersive VR can require physical movements. As Johan described, that can be difficult for people with disabilities. So if it is immersive VR, keeping those required movements simple, and if it's not immersive, and also having the option of having non-immersive options and keyboard accessibility. So kind of the overall takeaway, provide multiple options for how to access your content, and also creating static versions where possible as well. And that's it for me. So back to Jillian.
Thank you, Antonina. That was a really great example of a 360 VR desktop tour and how you've designed it to be accessible right from the beginning. If you're looking at virtual worlds and simulations, if you're looking for off-the-shelf products and want to assess them, or if you're starting from scratch and building something, here are 3 key resources that will help guide you. And I'll talk about the second resource first. I'll just grab it here. So this is the University of Melbourne, and the way that they're presenting their information is really looking at each sense, all the different senses, modalities, and then they've created a pros and cons list for each. So if you're wanting to get your feet wet and just start to get your head around the different needs of these different modalities, this is a really good place to start, and I would recommend looking at that site. So just as an example, and I think we've heard some positive things here today, that accessibility is not an insurmountable obstacle that we cannot overcome. It's actually an opportunity. And here's an example of a pro to these formats. So field trips, virtual field trips For example, give someone with mobility issues an opportunity to feel like they are there in a new place and learn about that place. So that's resource number 2 there, good introduction, pros and cons. The top resource that I would recommend you take a look at is the XRA Accessibility GitHub. And so these two organizations are emerging as really the big communities of extended reality accessibility people who are getting involved with industry. If you're interested in this area, you should subscribe to these organizations. And so I'll just show you the site. They've made a commitment to evolving information, keeping a central repository of information about extended reality accessibility. These two organizations, XR Access is from Cornell. I forget where the XRA Association is, but not only are they involved in accessibility, they're also involved in policy formulation. So they're working with government to help them understand about these technologies and how they're rapidly advancing, because right now technology is advancing without policy. There isn't any legislation or policy in place. So these are two great organizations to learn more about, and they have all of their resources here. There's a Chapter 3 Developer's Guide, and I think I have that up here. Oh, here it is here. So here's the last page from that chapter, and has this this chart here with accessibility techniques for the different modalities, for example. So all the different techniques. We're really just scratching the surface here, and the goal is to leave you with these resources that you can dig deeper into. But this is definitely your number one spot for everything you need to know right now about accessibility and extended reality. Now, the other place that we can learn from is game design. There's decades of game design research, and this site here, the Game Accessibility Guidelines, is also a very good place to go. And you can download an Excel spreadsheet from their website, and you can use this to guide your project. So all of the guidelines and strategies here for the different modalities, and then use that as a checklist to guide you through your own project if you're assessing an off-the-shelf product or creating something new. That's somewhere that you might want to go. So I think I've covered this slide. With the game design, the Game Accessibility Guidelines site and the Excel spreadsheet, it compartmentalizes from basic, intermediate to advanced strategies. And it's worth mentioning that the 4 most common strategies that you can deploy are remapping the controllers. So as Johan was describing, letting people change those what those controllers do, what those buttons do. And then these 3 strategies here that we already employ for online learning, which is text size, color blindness, and subtitle presentation. Yeah, and so I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about visually induced motion sickness, which a couple of people have mentioned now, and probably about 8 to 10% of users, that's the latest number that I have heard, will experience this with these immersive headsets. And here is a list of strategies from the Game Accessibility Guidelines that provide strategies for trying to reduce this sensation that happens when visually you feel like you're moving, because that's what virtual reality does. It makes you feel like you're experiencing that. So if you're showing movement, your body and your body is not moving, then there's this sort of feeling of discomfort, and people have compared it to car sickness. Definitely don't want that to happen with our students. So it's a good reason to start with mobile and desktop right there. But if you are lucky enough to be able to do some research and have a suite of headsets and can do pilot and experimentation, then you'll want to take a close look at these strategies so that you can reduce the risk of that. So it all involves movement, really, and making sure that the person is in control of the camera. You're not going to flood their peripheral vision, for example, and move them to another place and have all of this visual flood of information in their peripheral vision when they're not actually moving. So you want to have strategies like I've seen a nice gradual fade to black, and then you teleport someone to another place. So they appear in that place in a nice fade up rather than anything abrupt. You're not accelerating or decelerating. Objects aren't moving quickly. Have a horizon line. So you're not going to have someone act like think that they were in a bird's eye view. They're not a bird. That's not normal. We are on the ground. We have a horizon line. So kind of replicating our natural organic activities in real life. Yeah, so I think you'll come back to that if you are designing one of these projects in the future. So now I'll turn it over to Lynn. We haven't talked a lot about AR here, and Lynn is going to give some general guidance for augmented reality accessibility strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. So I have been tasked with just providing some guidelines for AR accessibility. And there are a number of strategies that can make augmented reality more accessible. Some of the guidelines for users with physical disabilities include avoiding experiences that require heavy headsets and large handheld controllers. A lot of this has been referred to already, but just a good reminder. And with stiff buttons. Intentionally selecting AR experiences that are compatible with accessible gamepads. As Johan was discussing, selecting experiences that accommodate diverse control options. For users with visual disabilities, employing principles common to website accessibility, as Jillian mentioned, providing sound effects, audio descriptions, text and image magnification, and appropriate color choice and contrast ratios to remove visual barriers. And for those with hearing disabilities, selecting experiences with adjustable volume, making transcripts and closed captioning available for audio elements. And when using transcripts and closed captioning, including dialogue as well as speaker identity and other sound effects in that, without obstructing information on the screen. Selecting experiences where caption controls function with a keyboard, a screen reader, or other assistive technology. And there's a website linked at the bottom where you can find those guidelines. I also, the next slide, Jillian, if you don't mind advancing it. Again, Johan covered some of this. He also showed accessible control alternatives, as were mentioned in the AR guidelines. But this slide shows some similar assistive or accessible controllers. Below each one, in the black square below, there's a link. If you want to find out more about each of those, you can follow the links if the slides are made available and learn more details about mouth-controlled options, foot-controlled options, single-hand options, and the accessible adapter that was mentioned earlier. I'll pass the control back over to Jillian. Are you next?
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Yeah. So really, we're at the end here now of the presentation, and we just wanted to leave you with some resources. I wanted to just go back to the one resource that I mentioned to you with the two big organizations. I just also wanted to point out that when you're choosing a tool to do your development, they have a full suite of information on each tool. So there's a big tool for AR and VR called Unity, for example, and it's actually emerging as quite a high in-demand skill in the workforce to have this knowledge of this tool. But I just wanted to mention that there are accessibility plugins that you can use. Johan mentioned this Scene VR, and so when you're looking for a program to develop, look for ones that have accessibility options built in, and this website here has a lot of information on that. With the resources that we use to create this presentation, these are two great videos. I would highly recommend the Regine Gilbert one, where she takes a deep dive mostly on AR, but also VR as well. And the University of Michigan gave an overview of their approach to extended reality accessibility. It's very similar to what we do with online learning right now, so that's a good video to watch. And a couple of papers there. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. And we'd be delighted to talk a little bit more. We only have a few minutes, but if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts, we'd be happy to talk.